Let's move on to main topic number 4. And our fourth main topic today gets submitted to us by Frank Gaveneau, who writes, "Hey, John and crew, just wanted to point out that tomorrow, Tuesday, that's today, is the official 20th anniversary of the release of maybe the most important comic book movie of all time, The X-Men. I know you've talked about it before, but can you reflect a little on the movie and its place in cinematic history? I can't believe it's been 20 freaking years." All right, thanks a lot for sending that in, Frank. And yeah, double check your watches. We talked about this on shows the other day that it was coming up, but today, July 14th, 2020, is the 20th anniversary of the July 14th, year 2000 release of the film X-Men. And I like the way you put it in the message that it's probably the most important film in comic book movie history. And I actually wholeheartedly agree that X-Men is, I'm not saying it's the best comic book movie ever made. Don't misinterpret me. Don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying it is the most I'm not saying it's the best comic book movie ever made, not by a long shot, but it is simply the most important. When you look at what happened, you have to go back, Rob, and I know you reflect on this a lot. You have to go back to 1999, and you have to remember and understand the context and the situation and the condition the comic book movie genre was in. It was not great at that point. They had some greatness earlier, but by the time, once you got past Batman and Robin and all this kind of stuff, there was a number of years where it struggled. You had the odd little thing like Blade. Blade, I think, maybe made like $130 million worldwide total. It wasn't that influential of a film, but I love Blade. I particularly love Blade 2, but it was still standard comic book kind of movie fare with an R edge to it. Then came X-Men. And X-Men came out and made a comic book movie in a way that comic book movies had never been done. And I would argue that the kind of template that X-Men laid down in 2000 is the template that the golden age of comic book movies, which we are living in right now, continue to follow to this day. They continue to follow to this day. And I'll never forget, the reason why I agree with the statement that X-Men is probably the most important of the comic book films ever made is I still remember hearing and listening to Dark Knight producer Charles Roven, who is a big producer for DC and Warner Brothers. He's produced a lot. He's included as a producer on the upcoming Snyder Cut as well. But Dark Knight producer Charles Roven talking about X-Men from 2000 and talking about how it was that time. And Rob, we've talked about this before, but how he discussed how it was when that movie came out, and we, talking about him and other Hollywood executives, when we saw that movie, that the light bulb went off. That, oh my God, you can make comic book movies like this? You can make comic book movies that both embrace the pop cultural icons that they are, but also apply sound, deep, important characteristics of proper filmmaking, good narrative, deep storylines, developed characters, blah, blah. You can do that all in the same movie. And it was at that point that Charles Roven said, for all of us in Hollywood, that was the moment that we realized that this comic book genre could be something so much more. Now, another producer by the name of Laura Ziskin, she was the producer on the Sam Raimi 2002 Spider-Man movie. And I remember her talking about the fact that, we understood we were already in development of Spider-Man when X-Men came out. We were already in development. But Laura Ziskin says, but when we saw that X-Men movie, we realized the bar really has changed. The game is now different. It's a completely different field of play now that this X-Men movie came out. And one of the other really big key ways that it did that was it wasn't just that opening scene, which again, the opening scene of X-Men is still to this day, I contend, the greatest opening scene of any comic book movie ever, period. And stop. Probably that'll never change. Where you had a comic book movie starting in this gray, rainy German concentration camp where they're about to drag off a bunch of Jews to the gas chamber, separating a young boy who would later become Magneto from his parents as he screams out in agony, and in his rage, the metal bends and all that kind of stuff. One of the most amazing things ever. But what it did was it introduced us, it did something that really no other comic book film had ever really done. It introduced us to a villain who was clearly the type of villain that would become a really good archetype moving forward, who we as the audience could have some empathy with, and as a villain who saw himself clearly as the hero of the story. And as you get into X-Men, Rob, and you get into Magneto, you're realizing, I understand why he's feeling this way. He feels he has a desire to save his people. And he has seen what humanity does to itself. He has seen what humanity does to his people. He has all this kind of stuff. And it was the first time really that we got a villain like that in a movie like this. And from that day forward, our understanding of what comic book movies are completely changed. Now, you could talk about, the original Christopher Reeve Superman movie and its importance. The 1989 Tim Burton Batman movie, yes. But the reason why I believe X-Men takes that spot is because according to the Hollywood executives and Hollywood producers who have produced all these big comic book films, it was that X-Men film that kicked off the most successful age for a genre probably in the history of this industry. And again, I'm not saying it is the greatest comic book movie of all time. I'm not even sure that, I don't even have it in the top 10. It's a great movie, but I don't have it in the top 10 best comic book movies of all time. But its importance can simply not be overstated. Anyway, Rob, we are sitting here now at 20 years, 20 damn years since that X-Men movie debuted. What are your thoughts on the film, and how do you look at it in terms of its place in comic book movie history?
Well, first of all, I think to continue on with what you were saying, one of the marvelous things about X-Men 1 is not only is it grounded in a certain reality from the very beginning, but Brian takes all of these, Brian Singer, the director, takes all of these outlandish concepts. I mean, if you think about all the characters in the movie, you have Sabretooth, you have Toad, you've got Wolverine and Storm and all the X-Men, but all these crazy, the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants. It's crazy pulp, goofy sci-fi comic book stuff that if it wasn't handled correctly, the tone of the movie could have been wildly different. You needed somebody, and Brian came in as the director. Like, he wasn't particularly attached to the comics. He watched the animated series, but he brought a seriousness to all of it, but not so it was oppressively serious. I mean, Toad still used his tongue, and Sabretooth was still Sabretooth, and he embraced sort of the pulp nature of it, but made a serious science fiction film, really. There's this great, crazy science fiction plot. Magneto's going to turn everybody into mutants on Liberty Island, and it's a crazy, pulpy sci-fi movie that could have been goofy as heck, but it's not. And like you said, John, it sets the tone, and it opened the door. Without X-Men, you couldn't have put Iron Man, Thor, and Captain America on screen together. It sort of gave a direction with which to follow in terms of how do you make a comic book movie work, and how do you make it work for modern audiences? How do you make it work for all people? Can adults go to these movies, or is it just for little kids? I'll tell you a funny story. As you might know, I produced both the X-Men and X-Men 2 special features for the DVD release, now the Blu-ray release. And producer Lauren Schuler Donner, who's Dick Donner's wife, she produced the movie. She didn't even go to the premiere because she was so convinced. They had a huge premiere on the Liberty Island where the Statue of Liberty is. Huge premiere there. And she didn't go because she was convinced the movie was going to fail. She thought that Brian's approach to it was not the correct one. I'm sure she won't tell you that now. But when I was doing the documentaries, that's what I found out. And even she told me she thought it wasn't going to work, and that the approach was too dour and it was too serious, because she had this idea that we're making a comic book movie. not knowing what Brian had really done, was distill how do you make a comic book movie for modern audiences that can be taken serious and yet still have the fun of a comic book. I mean, even the way they introduced Wolverine, cage fighting in a bar and with a bunch of good Canadian kids up in Alberta somewhere, that was an audacious way to introduce Wolverine. And the fact that, you see Rogue for the first time manifesting her powers when she's trying to kiss a boy in Louisiana. I mean, it was done in such a way that it really brought an adult importance to what could have been. There's still a lot of people at the time that are like, well, comic books don't have to, they're just for kids, right? Well, no. And X-Men prove that.
Like the kiddie concentration camps in Germany.
Right. And it was an audacious way to do. I mean, that movie, X-Men 1, I really like it. And yeah, they didn't have the effects budget they have now, and the plot, Magneto's plot's pretty goofy. But it all works. It all is very cool. I really like Bruce Davidson plays a senator in the film, and what happens to him, and it's pretty horrific. And they did a really good job. And I have to say, Brian did a really good job casting, getting Ian McKellen and Patrick Stewart to anchor that film as Xavier and Magneto was a genius move, because they brought a gravitas to that movie that worked. That first scene when you meet Magneto at the conference and Patrick Stewart, and they talk to one another, and it's like,
we're the future, Charles, not them.
I mean, so you remember that you do the cadence of his voice. I mean, it was so important, and you can quote it 10, 20 years later.
It's so good. But a trivia question for you: what happens to a toad when it gets hit by lightning, Rob?
Same thing that happens to everything else.
You still can't help but roll your eyes a little bit when you hear that line. But 20 years, guys. It has been 20 years to today, the 20th anniversary of, honestly, not the best, but I think, honestly, the most important comic book movie. I don't think we have a DCEU today. At least if you listen to Charles Roven, I don't think we have a DCEU today. I don't think we have an MCU today. I think the world of comic book films looks a lot different. Would we have gotten there eventually? Probably. But I honestly do think probably the most important film in comic book movie history. Anyway, guys, 20th anniversary of this film. What do you think about it turning 20? How do you look at it in terms of its historical significance? Jump down into the comment section below and let me know your thoughts. All right, guys.